A letter arrived from a place where words are not meant to escape, written in rhyme, unsigned, and soaked in the silence of the forgotten. What began as a puzzle of verse led into the shadows of madness, identity, and betrayal. This is not a tale of ghosts, but of men buried alive by lies too delicate to speak aloud. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a bleak October morning in the year 1894 that I found Sherlock Holmes in one of his less communicative moods, staring through the fog-slicked window of our sitting room in Baker Street. The air outside hung thick and grey, muffling the city's voice to a distant murmur. Within, the fire burned low and the coals hissed faintly. Holmes had not spoken since breakfast, save for a murmured complaint about the overdone toast. As I leafed through the Times, I could not help but sense that the silence in the room was not merely one of boredom, but of expectancy. With no word of warning, Holmes rose from his chair and drew the violin from its usual place by the mantel. The bow touched strings, and a slow, minor lament drifted through the fogged-up panes. It was not one of his usual Hungarian airs or sprightly Bach inventions, but something improvised, moody, methodical, and strangely discordant. I watched him closely. There was a restlessness in the music, a calculation behind the chaos. I had seen this before. It was Holmes' way of listening, not with his ears, but with his mind, to something that had not yet spoken, or perhaps had in whispers. The knock at the door was soft, almost apologetic. Mrs. Hudson entered with a puzzled frown and a single envelope held out before her. "It came by hand, sir. No name, no address, just the seal." Holmes took the letter without a word, studying the back with interest. "Bethlehem Royal Hospital," he murmured, tracing a pale blue crest pressed into the wax. "Better known, Watson, by its less forgiving moniker, Bedlam." He slit it open with the edge of a butter knife and removed a single folded sheet, yellowed at the edges and scrawled in uneven black ink. He sniffed it once, then twice. A cheap scent, masking antiseptic, and something darker. The writing jerked and spiraled, lines uneven and ink blotched. It was not signed. I leaned in to read, but Holmes raised a hand. "No, Watson. Let the madness speak to me first, before we presume to understand it." And with that, he began to read aloud. The letter's contents were as baffling as they were disturbing. "He watches from the hinge, but never blinks," Holmes read, voice low. "The one they buried still walks at noon, but not in shoes." The phrases bore no logic, but they were not without rhythm. Some passages rhymed loosely, others repeated phrases like incantations. "A lunatic scripture," I muttered. Holmes disagreed. "No, Watson, madness rarely organises itself with such method. This is either the work of a poet unravelling, or a rational man's forced to wear the robes of insanity." He turned the paper over, then held it to the firelight. A faint smudge became visible. 3 initials written in pencil, ERS. "It's not what is said, but how it is unsaid that interests me," he continued. "Observe the deliberate loop on the S, the sudden sharp angles here. This was written with intention, however fractured the surface may appear." He looked at me, eyes now sharp. "Something is very wrong." Holmes folded the letter with unusual care and slid it into his inside pocket. "Do you recall the Montague Asylum fraud, Watson? Or the case of the actor confined to a cell because he knew too many truths?" I nodded. "Then you will understand me when I say, this," he tapped his breast, "is no ordinary lunatic. This is a man who knows too much and has been permitted to say too little." He stood abruptly. "Coat, Watson, we are going out." "Out? In this fog?" I exclaimed. Holmes smiled faintly. There are darker vapours than these, my dear fellow, and some have names. The knock was not particularly forceful, but it carried a certain hesitancy that drew Holmes' attention away from his chemical flasks and toward the door. I opened it to find a woman of middle years, clad in plain grey serge, her gloved hands twisting the handle of a modest handbag. There was a certain haggard delicacy in her features, as though grief had worked its will upon her and then passed on, leaving only silence in its wake. "I beg your pardon," she said softly, "but are you Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" "I am," Holmes replied, with a nod that was at once courteous and calculating. "And you, madam, are in mourning, not merely for the dead, but for something unresolved." She blinked at this, taken aback. "My name is Agnes Falkland. My brother, Dr. Thomas Falkland, died 2 months ago. He was a physician at Bethlehem Royal Hospital." "Ah," Holmes said, drawing a chair for her. "We are already acquainted then, at least by correspondence." Her gloved hand trembled as she sat. I saw then that she was the sort of woman who did not weep in public, but who carried her sorrow like a sealed envelope pressed to the heart. "He wrote to me," she said, fumbling in her handbag, "3 days before his death." She produced a scrap of paper, crumpled and thin from having been handled too often. Holmes took it without comment. His eyes flicked over the line, then stilled. "They buried the wrong man, but he still listens." "There was no signature," she said. "Just that one line. And then the next day I was informed that he had slipped on the asylum stairs during a storm and broken his neck." Holmes handed me the note. The handwriting was cramped, pressed, almost etched into the paper. There was urgency in it, a message sent not in hope of rescue, but in final confession. "You had no reason to suspect your brother's mental state?" Holmes asked. "None. He was cautious, methodical, not excitable. And he loved his work, though he spoke very little of it." Holmes tapped his fingers against the armrest, gaze far off. "And yet, even a physician may die insane in an asylum, may he not?" Mrs. Falkland paled. "Are you suggesting he—" "I am suggesting nothing, madam. Your brother has already spoken. We have only to decide whether we shall listen." "There is more," she said at last. "He worked almost exclusively in what was called Ward 9. I have since asked others in the hospital, but they say that ward does not exist, at least not publicly." Holmes' brows lifted slightly. "A ward without a number, or rather one that prefers not to be numbered. Curious. It was kept locked at all times. Only my brother had keys, apart from the superintendent, Dr. Pembury. And the nature of the patients housed within? They told me they were incurables, but I once overheard Thomas telling our housekeeper that it wasn't madness he feared, it was silence." Holmes leaned forward. "Did he ever speak of a particular patient?" She hesitated, only in vague terms. "He called one of them the listener, said he had been brought in without any paperwork, no family, no diagnosis, but somehow he was dangerous." "Dangerous in what way?" "That I do not know, only that my brother said he remembered too clearly." Holmes stood and began to pace. "Ward 9, he murmured. "A forgotten cell in a house for the forgotten. What better place to make a man vanish?" He stopped and looked at her sharply. "Madam, what else are you not telling us?" She opened her handbag once more and withdrew a thin bundle of letters, each folded but not sealed. "These came after the funeral," she said, "all unsigned. Some typed, others scrawled by hand, each more strange than the last." Holmes took them eagerly and began flipping through the pages. I read over his shoulder. One bore the phrase, "The sane must pretend madness to survive among the mad." Another, "Ward 9 sings at midnight, but only in Morse." Several used the same erratic phrasing and broken rhythm as the letter we had received that morning. Holmes' interest was unmistakable. "These are written by more than one hand, but not more than one mind," he said. "You see the shift in script, the switch between fountain and ballpoint? A ruse. Someone wished to appear multiple, but failed to conceal their thought patterns. Do you believe these to be connected to my brother? Madam, I would wager these came not from beyond your brother's grave, but from the same pen that moved him toward it. She shuddered. They frighten me. Then take heart, Holmes said briskly, for fear is merely the acknowledgement of a truth too large to name, and I suspect we are close to naming it. Holmes suddenly sniffed the air and tilted his head. May I trouble you to remove your gloves, Mrs. Falkland? She looked startled. Why? Because you are concealing something, he said gently. Not from malice, but from fear. The ink on your thumb is not hospital ink. It's of a cheaper kind, the sort used in copy presses. You've been writing letters yourself and attempting to mimic another's hand. She coloured, eyes widening with alarm. Only one, she confessed. I tried to draw someone out. I imitated one of the strange letters and posted it to the asylum under no name. I was desperate. I wanted to see who might reply. Holmes nodded, and someone did. She handed him a folded page. This one with the single line, Your brother's ghost walks in daylight. He holds the key, but not in his hand. Holmes turned to me. Watson, if I am not mistaken, this is no longer merely the inquiry of a grieving sister. We are facing the orchestration of silence itself, and someone who understands how to speak through madness. He paused. Tell me, Mrs. Falkland, do you believe your brother was killed? Yes, she whispered, and I believe I was meant to follow him. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a whisper. Just before he died, my brother told me there was a man in Ward 9 who had no file, no name in the records, no visitors. He was simply placed there, a ghost in a hospital gown. Holmes said nothing, his expression unreadable. He said this man remembered details that had never been told to him. Names, deeds, secrets. Things from the outside world. But every time Thomas tried to investigate, someone closed the door. Who? Holmes asked. She shook her head. He never said, only that they were watching him as closely as they were drugging the patient. Watson, I noticed how Holmes's fingers drummed once upon the side table, a sure sign of his inward agitation. So, he said slowly, we have a man confined without cause, a doctor dead in a fall with no witnesses, and a string of letters that speak in code, but think in clarity. He turned to me suddenly. You recall the phrase from this morning's letter? They buried the wrong man. Yes, Holmes' eyes gleamed. I now begin to suspect they meant that quite literally. It was 2 days after our interview with Mrs. Falkland that Holmes and I found ourselves passing beneath the wrought iron gates of Bethlehem Royal Hospital, that ancient institution whose name had become synonymous with madness. Holmes had contrived our entry by way of a brief but cunning correspondence with Dr. Elijah Pembury, the current acting superintendent, in which he posed as a medical enthusiast researching historical treatments for catatonia. I was, by Holmes' appointment, his colleague and companion in study, a role I assumed with no small discomfort. We were received in the front vestibule by Dr. Pembury himself, a tall, thin gentleman of severe appearance and impeccable manners. His voice carried the even tone of a man long accustomed to listening more than he spoke, though there was an unmistakable wariness in his eyes that grew more pronounced, as Holmes politely inquired after certain rare cases housed in the older wings of the hospital. Our archives are available to you, Pembury said, with what might have been a smile. But I must caution you that some of our wards remain restricted for the protection of patients and staff alike. Holmes bowed in gratitude, but I could see the gleam behind his eyes. I quite understand, Doctor, he replied. It is often the doors we are told not to open that conceal the most instructive specimens. Dr. Pembury escorted us through a maze of stone corridors, his keys jangling with every step. The air grew heavier the deeper we went, less from lack of ventilation than from the weight of history, like the residue of long-forgotten screams. We passed cells lined with narrow windows, each with its own particular silence. Some whispered prayers. Others hummed old songs through cracked lips. Eventually, we came to a branch of the corridor that struck me as peculiarly bare. No nameplates, no scent of antiseptic, just a length of corridor lit by a single flickering lamp, at the end of which stood a heavy iron door, undecorated and unmarked. Holmes paused there, feigning an idle curiosity. "A curious architecture," he remarked, "and no indication of which ward lies beyond." Dr. Pembury did not miss a beat. "Storage, structural repairs were needed. That section is no longer in use." Holmes turned slowly. "Yet I detect the faint scent of phenol and old paper, not the sort one usually associates with mops and buckets." Pembury's smile thinned. "We manage as we can, Mr. Holmes." We moved on, but I noticed Holmes casually brush the edge of the wall near the door with his cane, marking the flaking plaster with the lightest of pressure. He said nothing, but as we turned the corner, I saw his expression had changed. He had found something, or rather, had found where something had been carefully hidden. It was while examining a rack of patient charts near the records office that Holmes happened upon a young nurse, pale, red-haired, and possessed of that nervous energy one often sees in the newly trained. She was replacing a folder, and at the mention of Ward 9, she dropped her keys with a clatter that echoed unnaturally in the corridor. "Steady, miss," Holmes said gently, retrieving the ring of keys. "Ward 9 is just a turn of phrase, I take it?" She hesitated. I wouldn't know, sir. We're not supposed to speak of it." "But you have heard the name?" She swallowed. "Only once. From Dr. Falkland. He said there was someone in there who shouldn't be." Holmes' voice softened. "And did anyone else ever refer to this person?" She looked about furtively. "Only Dr. Pembury. He called him the Silent One." Holmes handed back her keys. "You've been very helpful." As she hurried away, he murmured to me, "Note the tremor in her left hand, Watson. That was not fear of me. That was fear of memory. There is something about Ward 9 they dare not forget, but also cannot allow to be remembered." Later that afternoon, we were shown to Dr. Pembury's office, ostensibly to examine historical admission records for Holmes' study. It was a large, high-ceilinged room with oak shelves, medical diagrams, and the unmistakable aroma of formaldehyde. Holmes allowed Pembury to direct his attention to a table of catalogues and thick folios, all carefully arranged. The man watched us with the pleasant detachment of a spider observing insects from the edge of a web. When the doctor was called away momentarily, summoned by an assistant on some minor emergency, Holmes moved with startling speed. He opened the lowest drawer of the writing desk and produced a half-burned file, its cover crisped at the edge. Within was a page, still intact, bearing the initials ERS. No admission date, no diagnosis, no physician's notes. Curious. "Another ghost?" I whispered. "Perhaps," he said, "but even ghosts leave shadows." Holmes held the page to the window, turning it gently. "This was deliberately destroyed, but not by fire alone. See here, Watson. Ink erased and replaced. A second hand tampering with the first." He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his coat. "Let us go. The House of Shadows has yielded its first secret. Now we must discover who benefits from keeping it buried." That evening, as the light dimmed over the rooftops of London, Holmes summoned me to the table with a peculiar gleam in his eye. He had been leafing through a bundle of clippings and private correspondences secured through his network of informants, and at the centre of it all lay a photograph, grainy, with the yellowing curl of age. "Observe, Watson," he said, "the man in the corner, seated, yet commanding, taken at a dinner of the Royal Society 4 years ago." I examined the face, narrow, with intelligent eyes, and an aristocratic bearing not easily disguised. "His name," Holmes continued, "was Edgar Reuben Sinclair, a minor peer, known in legal circles for his involvement in a brewing embezzlement scandal. He vanished in 1891 without trial, Reputation ruined. The matter was hushed. And now? I asked. Now he appears under initials alone in a half-burned asylum ledger. No diagnosis, no date, no family contact. Holmes leaned back. Dr. Falkland met with him privately. I suspect he saw a man wrongfully confined. A gentleman's silence not for madness, but for knowing too much. And he vanished days before Falkland's death? Convenient, is it not? Holmes tapped the photograph. This is our ghost, Watson. A sane man imprisoned in the company of the insane, because someone feared what he remembered. The following day found Holmes seated cross-legged upon the rug in our sitting room, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and several chemical solutions arranged before him in tidy rows. Upon the table, spread with surgical care, lay the scorched page he had rescued from Pembury's drawer. He applied a pale tincture to the paper's edge with a camel hair brush, watching with narrow intensity as faded ink began to reappear along the grain. It is the second hand I wish to unearth, he said. The first was erased clumsily, but not completely. Ink, like guilt, leaves its residue. Letter by letter, a name revealed itself. Edgar Reuben Sinclair. Holmes smiled without humour. They meant to erase the man. But paper, like conscience, remembers. But why not simply destroy it, I asked. Why leave the record at all? Because the bureaucracy of concealment is cautious, he replied. Total erasure arouses suspicion. Better to misfile, to obscure in shadows, than to burn entirely. A burnt book is a headline. A hidden one is simply forgotten. He turned the paper once more and examined the handwriting. The entry is not Falkland's. It is Penbury's. A forged committal. Holmes nodded. And likely without trial or consent. Sinclair was deposited like luggage, unnamed, unclaimed, and they hoped, unheard. He stood, brushing off his hands. But he was heard, Watson, in letters, in whispers, in madness carefully performed. I stared at the page. You mean he pretended? I believe, Holmes said quietly, that Edgar Reuben Sinclair feigned lunacy for years, in order to remain alive long enough to be found. He turned to the window where the fog pressed softly against the glass. And now, Watson, he murmured, we must go find the man who vanished twice. It was just after midnight when I found myself pacing the floor of our lodgings, listening for the distant footfall that would confirm Holmes' return. He had left hours before, wrapped in the grey uniform of a hospital porter, his movements cloaked in the anonymity granted to those who move unseen by design. I shall learn more in 2 hours among the mad than in 2 days among their keepers, he had said, fastening the buttons of the coarse tunic with theatrical calm. As the clock struck 1:30, the front door creaked open and Holmes entered, eyes alight, his usually neat attire now creased and dust-marked. Success? I asked. He removed his gloves without a word and handed me a folded paper. The floor plan of the West Wing, outdated but close enough. He poured himself a stiff brandy and sank into his chair. Cell 12, he said, was unlocked by a woman who did not know she was betraying her orders. I offered to take linens to the incorrigibles and she, poor soul, simply nodded. And inside? Holmes looked at me with a strange mixture of fury and fascination. A room where a man once waited, not paced, not wept, waited. He drew a small notebook from his pocket and opened it to a sketch. A wooden bed frame, rough carved and scarred by years of use. There were words, scratched beneath, he said. But they were not the words of a madman. He leaned forward. They drugged my mind, not my memory. We sat in silence. For the first time, I saw Holmes not merely intrigued, but disturbed. The bed was the key, Holmes murmured. No books, no paper. But they left him the bed. Wood dulls slower than ink fades. He drew out a second sheet from his coat, a rubbing, done in pencil, revealing letters crudely scratched into the underside of the frame. I saw deliberate spacing, Not the random etchings of the delusional, he said. The script bore the rhythm of thought, conscious thought, Watson. The inscription read, "They drugged my mind, not my memory. I remember everything." Holmes tossed the rubbing onto the table as if it burned his fingers. They kept him quiet by dulling his senses, but the man inside never vanished. He played the fool to survive. I stared at the words, feeling something twist in my stomach. "Holmes," I said quietly, "if that is Sinclair, and he is alive—" "He was alive," Holmes interrupted, "but cell 12 is empty now. The nurse said he was moved 3 days before Falkland's accident." Then Falkland was silenced for asking too many questions. Precisely. Holmes refilled his glass but did not drink. This was not the suppression of madness, Watson. It was the burial of knowledge, buried alive. A pause followed, heavy with implication. "I fear," he added coldly, "that we are now dealing with murder concealed beneath the robes of medicine, a madness used as a curtain drawn against justice." Over the next 2 days, we worked tirelessly, Holmes weaving threads from names and ledgers, while I ploughed through legal registers, estate announcements, and property deeds. It was not long before a pattern began to form, one that spoke not of illness, but of avarice. Sinclair had been heir to a modest estate in Wexford, though its holdings had recently tripled in value owing to a mineral rights dispute settled just prior to his disappearance. With Sinclair vanished, the entire inheritance passed to his cousin, Lord Alaric Mellington. Holmes tapped the edge of the old family register. "Note the date of transfer, Watson. Mere weeks after Sinclair was last seen in public, and no inquiry into his disappearance. None. A quiet withdrawal from society. Whispers of a breakdown. Letters never verified." It became apparent that Sinclair had been not merely silenced, but erased, removed from the world, just as his holdings were poised to mature. "Who stood to gain?" Holmes asked rhetorically, flipping through Falkland's old correspondence, which Mrs. Falkland had entrusted to us. One letter, dated 8 months before the doctor's death, mentioned a patient who speaks in riddles but remembers too much. Holmes closed the folder. "This was not institutional error," he said. "It was design, as cleanly executed as any forgery, but spread across silence, drugs, and legal indifference." "And Falkland?" I asked. "Falkland, I fear, remembered too late, and paid the price." Lord Alaric Mellington was not a man often seen in public. When he was, it was at gallery openings or political luncheons, always smiling faintly, always polished, but never known too well. Yet the papers had recently been kind to him. Since inheriting the Sinclair estate, he had married into a well-bred Yorkshire family and was now rumoured to be courting a political seat. Holmes had little difficulty obtaining an invitation to a charitable soirée hosted at Mellington's London residence. We observed the man from afar, tall, with hawkish features and a voice that smoothed like varnish over wood. "Note the hands," Holmes murmured. "Soft, manicured, no habit of writing or instrument work. A man who signs things but never reads them. And yet the papers attribute to him several land negotiations," I remarked, "which is what makes them suspicious." As we left the gathering, Holmes said, "He is too clean, too unremarkable, which, in a case such as this, is an offence in itself." Back at Baker Street, Holmes retrieved a file he had kept sealed until now. Inside was Sinclair's embezzlement record, or rather, the one circulated through unofficial channels. It bore no official crest, no court seal. "A fabrication," Holmes confirmed. Mellington's solicitor once represented a man arrested for similar charges. Same phrasing, entire sections lifted word for word. But Sinclair? "Innocent," Holmes said, "and imprisoned not for what he stole, but for what he could reveal." I looked down at the forged report, the silent cell, and the vanishing patient. Holmes reached for his pipe. "We now have a ghost, without a grave, a lord with a borrowed title, and a question no one dares ask." He exhaled slowly. Where, Watson, is the man who remembers everything? And why is he still being kept silent? It was a small announcement in the Morning Post that caught Holmes' attention. A society notice, tucked between engagements and birth announcements, marking the marriage of Lord Alaric Mellington to Miss Catherine Braithwaite, eldest daughter of Colonel Braithwaite of Hampshire. An unremarkable pairing, I said, glancing at the clipping. Except, Holmes replied, that Miss Braithwaite was once Miss Catherine Sinclair. He handed me an old engagement notice, now yellowed and soft at the edges. She was betrothed to Edgar Reuben Sinclair not a year before his disappearance. I stared. And now she is Lady Mellington? The timing is interesting, Holmes said mildly. Their courtship began mere weeks after Sinclair's reported breakdown, before any public resolution of the charges. You believe she knew? I believe, Holmes said, that she chose not to ask. He sat with steepled fingers. This, Watson, is not merely a case of property or inheritance. It is the art of social resurrection. One man buried, another raised from his absence, and the woman caught between them choosing the living title over the buried truth. What do you mean to do? Holmes turned back to the clipping. We follow the name that changed, he said, for it is in such changes that guilt hides best, and we ask whether she is a widow or a wife, and whether the distinction matters to the man who now shares her bed. His tone was calm, but his eyes betrayed the cold fire behind them. That evening, Holmes sat in his chair with a writing board balanced across his knees, composing with the precision of a surgeon drawing ink through tissue. I knew better than to interrupt him when he entered such a state, but as the clock struck 9:30, he spoke without looking up. I believe we have enough, Watson. The picture is incomplete, but the silhouette is unmistakable. Then you mean to act? I mean to unsettle, he said. Our adversary has relied on silence and forgetfulness. Let us test how he fares against memory and suggestion. He finished the letter and sanded the page. To Lord Mellington, he explained, from an anonymous source claiming to have seen a man matching Sinclair's description alive near Paddington. I frowned. But Sinclair is alive, is he not? I believe so. But whether he remains free or drugged and hidden is a separate matter. And what do you expect this letter to accomplish? Holmes smiled. A guilty conscience, Watson, responds more sharply to whispers than accusations. It is like tossing a pebble into still water. The ripples reach places the eye cannot see. He sealed the envelope. I shall begin as an unseen hand, the kind that tugs at a thread others thought safely knotted. He leaned back, eyes gleaming, and if the tremor reaches the right nerve, the man who buried Sinclair may dig his own way toward panic. 2 mornings later, as Holmes sliced a kipper with absent precision, he received a telegram, unsigned but marked urgent. He read it once, folded it, and placed it beneath his saucer. Well, I prompted. Our bait has taken, he said simply. Mellington has postponed his appearance at the Halifax Investment Board, citing sudden indisposition. He was seen last night entering a private hotel in Mayfair under an assumed name, an old habit of his, it seems. To speak with someone, to hide from someone, Holmes corrected. Perhaps a ghost, perhaps a letter. It matters little. What matters is that he's moving. He stood and reached for his gloves. Now, Watson, we begin the part I most enjoy. Controlled chaos. I rose, but paused. Holmes, what if we're wrong? He paused, looking at me with that cool, faint amusement that often masks deep certainty. My dear Watson, he said, the man we chase has walked among lunatics, ghosts, and forged names. If we are wrong, he shall not notice. But if we are right, he tucked the envelope into his coat. Then the first lie has just begun to unravel, and the thread is pulling itself loose. I have seen Holmes assume many roles over the years, an Italian priest, a Dutch bookseller, a German mechanic, but never had I witnessed him clad in such cold formality as when he presented himself as Mr. Jonathan Elbridge. solicitor of the Crown's Office for Mental Affairs. The transformation was chilling in its restraint. A greying wig, gold pince-nez, and precisely tailored frock coat that lent him an air of measured bureaucratic menace. The ruse had been carefully laid. A message dispatched to Lord Mellington had informed him that a solicitor acting on behalf of Bedlam's archives would be delivering a sealed letter believed to have been composed by Sinclair himself. A legal obligation, Holmes had stated with serene finality, and men like Mellington, Watson, fear obligations more than they fear ghosts. The event was arranged under the pretext of discretion. Only 5 individuals were invited to the drawing room of Mellington House that evening. The Lord himself, his wife, a close cousin, his private physician, and one unnamed attendant whose identity Holmes kept from me. "You shall accompany me, of course," he said, handing me an invitation with the royal seal, forged naturally, but to impeccable standard. "And what role shall I play?" I asked. "The witness, Watson, always the witness." He paused with a glance toward the window. "This is not merely a performance. It is a noose, woven from ink and memory. All I must do is tighten it slowly and let the truth speak." He slipped the false credentials into his coat and straightened his cuffs. "Let us see how the truth performs when it wears a solicitor's smile." The drawing room of Mellington House was a grand affair, yet curiously hollow. Beneath the weight of chandeliers and silk draperies there lay a quiet tension, like the stale air of a theatre between acts. We were greeted without warmth. Lord Mellington, tall and outwardly composed, offered the faintest nod. Lady Mellington, once Miss Sinclair, stood by the fireplace, a frozen portrait in emerald satin. Holmes, in his guise as Mr. Elbridge, spoke little but carried himself with deliberate weight. He nodded politely to each guest, then turned to the footman. "If you would close the doors, please. This is a confidential proceeding under the institution's discretion." The man obeyed, and Holmes drew from his satchel a single envelope, aged and sealed. He placed it upon a silver tray at the centre of the table. "This letter," he said, "was recovered from records sealed by Dr. Thomas Falkland. Its contents were dictated by a patient admitted under circumstances now under legal review." He allowed the silence to settle. Lady Mellington reached for her husband's sleeve, but he did not acknowledge her. I observed each face carefully. The cousin feigned interest. The physician looked bored. But Mellington, he was too still, not curious, not sceptical, aware. Holmes unsealed the envelope with slow precision and drew forth the pages. He did not look at anyone as he began to read. The voice he adopted was neutral, almost dispassionate, but the words that followed seemed to drop like pins into a quiet cathedral. "My name," he read, "has been removed, but I am still listening." And in that instant, every head turned toward the man who had gained most by forgetting. "My memory," Holmes read, "is the only thing they could not take from me. They silenced my tongue. They dimmed my vision, but they could not remove what I had witnessed." Lord Mellington had crossed one leg over the other and sat like a man listening to a weather report. But I noticed the faint tapping of his boot upon the carpet. Holmes continued. "I saw the document signed. I saw the sum transferred. I saw the man who delivered the bribe. And I knew his face, though they said I had imagined it. He turned a page. The embezzlement was never mine. The file was a ghost. The witnesses were paid. The silence was bought with my mind. But minds, as you may know, are not property. Not even in Bedlam." Mellington cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Elbridge," he said, "may I ask, was this letter authenticated?" Holmes did not look up. "It is not the handwriting that matters, Lord Mellington. It is the memory. Another page. I dreamed I was buried, and yet each time I awoke, I remembered the name of the man who had buried me. He wore my cousin's ring." There was a brief intake of breath, sharp, feminine. Lady Mellington had gone pale. Holmes paused. "Would you like me to stop, my lord?" Mellington smiled tightly. "Do go on. I am sure this will make an amusing tale for the archives." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, the archives are fond of fiction, but this one, alas, ends in murder." He folded the letter slowly and returned it to the envelope. "You see," he said, rising, "the writer of this letter is not dead, and he is not mad, and he remembers every detail of the betrayal committed by those who were supposed to protect him." His eyes locked on Mellington's. "The question, then, is how you intend to forget what he remembers. There is a particular expression I have learned to recognize in guilty men, a subtle crack behind the eyes, where certainty once lived. Lord Mellington bore that look now, though he masked it behind a tight jaw and an over-studied laugh. "My dear fellow," he said, rising with his brandy glass in hand, "I do hope you're not here to threaten me with ghost stories and forged poetry." Holmes, still perfectly in character, merely arched an eyebrow. "My lord, the Crown does not send threats. It sends auditors." At this, Mellington's hand trembled slightly. He turned toward the physician with a smile too wide. "Well, doctor, what do you make of our guest's little theatrical production?" But the physician said nothing, nor did Lady Mellington, who had seated herself with sudden heaviness and now stared at her lap as though it might whisper answers. Holmes moved to the hearth, removing his gloves with slow precision. "Would you be surprised, Lord Mellington," he said, "to learn that Sinclair has been seen, alive, within the last week?" That did it. The brandy glass struck the hearth as Mellington's hand betrayed him at last. "Rubbish!" he snapped. "That man was insane. He vanished years ago." "And yet his voice remains," Holmes replied quietly. A stillness followed. Then Holmes turned to the door. "Watson," he said calmly, "would you be so kind as to admit our final witness?" At Holmes's cue, I crossed the drawing room and opened the heavy door. For a moment, the corridor beyond seemed empty, until one of the footmen, a man I had passed earlier without comment, stepped forward. He moved with an uncertain gait, his gloved hands clasped before him, eyes lowered. No one in the room stirred. He entered silently, and for a beat, not a soul spoke. Then Holmes said quietly, "You may remove the coat." The footman complied. The coat came off, then the cap, and with them, the illusion. What was revealed beneath was a gaunt phaeton older than I recalled, but unmistakably bearing the haunted dignity of Edgar Reuben Sinclair. Lady Mellington let out a strangled sound and backed away. The cousin rose sharply to his feet, and Lord Mellington, to his credit, did not move, but I saw the blood vanish from his cheeks. Sinclair spoke, slowly, hoarsely, as if unpracticed. "I was not mad, only made to seem so, but I remembered my name, and I remembered who signed me away." The weight of those words landed like iron upon the chamber. Mellington exhaled, with a sound between contempt and astonishment. "This is absurd. You expect me to believe that this half-dead servant is the man who vanished 6 years ago?" "I expect nothing," Holmes said, stepping forward. "But the handwriting of the letter matches Sinclair's military correspondence. His medical scar matches the Bedlam record. And more importantly," he turned to Lady Mellington, "your wife recognized him before you did." She flinched visibly. Holmes allowed the silence to hang once more before speaking. "We are now at the point, my lord," he said evenly, "where lies will only worsen your position." And with that, Sinclair, the mute no longer, stepped forward once more, standing directly before the man who had stolen his life. There is something in Holmes' sense of timing that borders on the orchestral. Just as the last vestige of doubt began to take root in the minds of those assembled, he reached into his coat, removed the gold pince-nez, and, with slow, deliberate precision, peeled back the disguise. The hair came loose. The false spectacles vanished. The solicitor was no more. A collective intake of breath swept the room. "Sherlock Holmes," Mellington spat, rising. This is entrapment." Holmes was unbothered. "No, my lord. This is theatre. The trap came long before the curtain rose." He stepped forward, now wholly himself, sharp, erect, and terrible in his clarity. "Shall I recount the timeline?" he said, addressing the room. "Sinclair, accused on false testimony, is admitted to Bedlam. The cousin inherits. Within weeks, the betrothed becomes the bride. Years pass. No inquest, no suspicion. Only one detail was miscalculated." He turned to Mellington. He forgot that Sinclair kept a copy of the forged deed, and that he had mailed it, unsigned but marked, to a solicitor's office that vanished in the fire of '92. That office was reconstituted under new management last year. I found the envelope, intact, with Sinclair's initials. The cousin stammered. "Even so, you have no legal proof." "I have the records," Holmes cut in. "I have the signed notes from Dr. Pembury acknowledging sedation at the request of a family relation. I have Lady Mellington's altered bank drafts, drawn from the Sinclair estate on her honeymoon." Lady Mellington had turned away entirely now, her face buried in her hands. Holmes stepped back and nodded toward me. "Watson, kindly inform Inspector Gregson he may enter." Mellington, for the first time, looked truly afraid, and that, I believe, was the moment the performance ended and judgment began. Mellington did not wait. As Holmes turned toward me, he made a sudden lurch for the doorway, shoving aside the nearest chair. There was a shout from the cousin and a shriek from Lady Mellington as he dashed through the arch. Holmes did not follow. He merely raised a hand and said, "3 seconds, Watson." He was wrong. It took 4. From the far end of the corridor came the distinct bark of command and the sharp thud of boots. 2 officers in plain clothes intercepted Mellington just beyond the parlour threshold. There was a struggle, brief, almost pathetic in its futility, and then Mellington was hauled back into the chamber, his face pale with fury and fear. "You've no right," he spluttered. "The Crown does," Holmes replied coolly, "and Scotland Yard, who received my report last week, has come prepared." Mellington looked wildly to his wife, but she did not meet his gaze. He looked next to Sinclair but found only silence and weariness. Gregson stepped forward at last, offering Holmes a nod of quiet respect. "Your witness, Mr. Holmes." Holmes shook his head. "Not mine, Inspector, the world's." As Mellington was led out, his shoes scraping against the floor like an echo of a vanishing title, Holmes folded his arms. "There's something poetic," he murmured to me, "about a man trying to flee the house he stole." And with that, we turned our eyes to the last domino. It was 3 days later that Dr. Pembury, the former medical director of Bedlam's restricted ward, was quietly arrested at his private clinic in Richmond. Holmes, having obtained transcripts of bribes concealed as consultation fees, delivered the evidence without flourish. "Pembury," he remarked over breakfast, "sold not medicine, but silence. That's always the more expensive drug. The newspapers called it the Bedlam conspiracy, and public appetite devoured it. But Holmes, for his part, had already turned to a new monograph. "Memory, Watson," he said, tapping his pen, "is the only thing more dangerous than guilt. It has the better aim. We returned to Baker Street under a veil of thickening fog, the sort that seemed at times to cling even to one's thoughts." Holmes was uncharacteristically silent during the cab ride, his eyes half-lidded and fingers steepled as if still conducting a quiet symphony of consequences within that remarkable mind. It was not until we were once more seated before the fire, Holmes with his pipe, I with my untouched brandy, that the tension of the evening at last gave way to my growing demand for clarity. "Well, Holmes," I began, "you have, as always, dazzled your audience and brought justice into alignment with truth. But I confess I am still very much in the dark as to how you deduced that Sinclair was both alive and still within arm's reach of the Mellington household." Holmes gave a short laugh and leaned back in his chair. My dear Watson, when one is presented with madness, one must first ask who benefits from its diagnosis. Bedlam is not a charitable institution, nor is its silence bought cheaply. He drew in a long breath of tobacco smoke. From the outset, I doubted the reported death, too convenient, too timely, and then the inheritance, not merely of land, but of a fiancé, a title, and a reputation unsullied by scrutiny. But you had no body, I interjected. No grave, no death certificate. Exactly, he said, tapping the bowl of his pipe against the edge of his chair. And yet the world accepted Sinclair's absence as a death. That, Watson, was their first mistake. He reached for a sheaf of papers and laid them across the table between us. Shall we begin then? He said. It is time you met the two men who tried to become one. Holmes smoothed the first paper with the back of his hand. This, he said, is a signed witness statement by a nurse named Adelaide Cripps. She served at Bedlam between 84 and 87, during which time she was paid twice her wage by a Mr. Simon Mellington, under the pretence of special patient care. Simon Mellington, I echoed. The cousin. More than cousin, Holmes said. Co-conspirator, forger, and a man who discovered early that if he could not best Sinclair in character, he might do so in absence. The plan required two pieces: a physician willing to brand a man insane and a motive to ensure silence. He flipped to the next sheet, a copy of a naval censure dated 5 years earlier. Dr. Pembury, while serving aboard HMS Truro, was implicated in a scandal involving the morphine-induced death of a naval officer, witnessed by one Edgar Reuben Sinclair, who was then serving as a junior aide. I stared. So Sinclair was not just an obstacle to Mellington's inheritance, he was a witness to Pembury's ruin. Holmes nodded. Precisely. The doctor had everything to lose. Mellington, everything to gain. One required concealment, the other a vacancy. Their paths converged at the gates of Bedlam. But would Pembury truly risk his licence for that? Holmes gave a thin smile. For a ruined reputation? For silence? Men have committed murder for less. He reached for the decanter and poured himself a modest measure. In the end, he said, the only thing more dangerous than a secret is a secret shared. Mellington and Pembury were bound by mutual destruction. It made them efficient. It also made them predictable. And it made Sinclair, I murmured, disappear. Holmes merely raised his glass in answer. What kept the illusion alive, Holmes continued, was not silence, but noise, a constant barrage of falsehoods, records rewritten, letters redirected. You recall the forged death notice? It was signed by an attendant who had died the year before. I blinked. But how could that go unnoticed? Because no one thought to check, he replied crisply. The Bedlam archives were a labyrinth of initials and ink. All they required was a semblance of formality, and Pembury provided it. He produced a slip of browned paper from the pile. But the real undoing began here. A letter, no signature, no return address. But the phrasing, "Ah, Watson," it bore the mark of a desperate man still clinging to logic. He handed it to me. I read aloud. He who sleeps in names not his own will wake to find his house not his. A riddle, I said, but also a warning. Indeed. It reached the solicitor's office in Brixton, the same one Sinclair had used years prior to store certain documents, including, as fate would have it, a copy of his will and a record of his cousin's financial discrepancies. When the office reopened under new proprietors, the file was unearthed. Holmes rose and paced to the hearth. That was the crack in the dam. From there, I merely followed the water. And Sinclair? I asked. How did you find him? Holmes paused. I didn't, he said. He found me, disguised, silent, and patient. He smiled faintly, the one virtue Bedlam unwittingly taught him. Holmes returned to his chair and fixed me with a gaze of quiet satisfaction. You may recall, Watson, that when we visited Bedlam in disguise, there was a man who stared at us with neither alarm nor interest, but recognition. The mute in the East Wing, I said. He nodded. Precisely, Holmes said. Only one man among the 10 exhibited that flicker of awareness, and that was enough for me. From there, the rest was theatre. He folded his hands. Sinclair preserved himself through performance. He adopted silence not as a symptom, but as a strategy. By mimicking the lunacy expected of him, he escaped the more brutal wards. He was fed, clothed, forgotten, and above all, he listened. I could hardly imagine the effort it must have required. Years of restraint, of swallowing one's identity in order to preserve it. And why not speak, once we found him? I asked. Why keep up the pretense? Because the performance was not yet complete, Holmes replied. If he had broken character too soon, it would have given Mellington a final edge, a claim that Sinclair was delusional or coached. We needed to strike at the moment of greatest certainty. Holmes leaned back and sighed, as though letting the weight of the tale finally settle. In the end, he was not mad, Watson. He was patient. That is a rarer condition. I nodded slowly. So the lunatic was the sanest of all. Holmes smiled. Isn't it often so? He took another draw from his pipe and gazed into the fire. Sometimes, he murmured, it is not justice that wakes a man from darkness, but the chance to speak in his own name once more. And for the first time that evening, I saw the faintest trace of reverence behind his eyes. There remained, however, one figure whose part in the tragedy had eluded even my earlier understanding, a man whose name had surfaced but briefly in Holmes' investigation and then vanished into the shadows. It was Holmes who brought him forward again with unexpected gravity. Dr. Falkland, he said, lighting a fresh match to his pipe, an unassuming man of sparse words and excessive conscience. I frowned. He was employed at Bedlam, was he not? For a short time only, Holmes confirmed. He was assigned to the East Wing and given access to the mute patients, among whom Sinclair had been confined. And he recognized him. He did more than that, Holmes said quietly. He read between the lines of Sinclair's silences, noticed the minute reactions, the flashes of comprehension, and eventually, in an act either brave or foolish, likely both, he attempted to make contact. Holmes drew from the pipe and exhaled slowly. He left a letter in a hollow behind the chapel wall, a page torn from a copy of Othello, annotated in pencil. Sinclair found it. But Falkland is dead, I said. He drowned, didn't he? That was the report. Holmes looked at me steadily. The water was shallow. His hands were broken. I sat back, chilled. Then he was silenced, discreetly and without notice. A suicide, on record, but murder in truth. And you say nothing of it? I asked. What could I say, Watson? The evidence lies 6 feet deep, but let us, at least, remember him as he was. The only man who tried to open a door everyone else had bolted shut. There was a moment's stillness in our sitting room, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece. I had thought the matter nearly closed when Holmes reached for the original letter, the one unsigned, riddled with riddles, and laid it once more upon the table. You knew, didn't you? I said. From the very beginning. I suspected, Holmes replied. The truth, as so often, lay not in what was said, but how it was said. He tapped the parchment with a slender finger. You recall the line? He who sleeps in names not his own will wake to find his house not his. I do, I said. It seemed oddly lyrical for a man thought insane. Precisely. The cadence, Watson. Madness has jagged edges, jarring syntax. It does not construct symmetry. But here, he traced the sentence in the air. There is control, a rhythm of 4 and 5. The pattern of a trained, perhaps even classically educated mind. And so you believed it was Sinclair? Holmes gave a nod. Only a man conscious of both danger and concealment could write with such restraint. It takes a sane man to mimic madness without losing rhythm. He sank back into his chair. From that line forward, the charade began to crumble. But what fascinated me most, Watson, was not the deception, but the artistry of it. Sinclair had become his own cipher, a man disguised not only in face and name, but in his very thought. You mean he hid behind the rhythm? Holmes smiled. Exactly. It was a message in meter, and in recognizing it we found not only a victim, but the ghost of a poet who refused to go quietly into misremembered history. In the quiet hours, after Holmes had recounted the final stitch of the case, I found myself restless, wandering from window to hearth and back again. My friend, ever the image of placid indifference, refilled his pipe with a solemnity I found almost provoking. "There is something terrible in it, Holmes," I said at last, "that a man could be stolen from his own name, shut behind walls, and made into a phantom. Also others might thrive undisturbed." Holmes did not look up. "It is not so rare as you imagine. That makes it worse," I replied. "If justice depends on you to intervene, what becomes of those who go unnoticed? Of the Falklands, the Sinclairs?" Holmes leaned forward slightly, the flare of the match he struck catching a sudden sharpness in his eye. "You see the cruelty," he said. "I see the structure that allows it. Bedlam was never meant to shelter the mad, only to house the inconvenient. Sinclair had no need of a doctor. He needed a witness." "And yet," I said, "he found only a cell." "A padded one," Holmes murmured, "lined with silence and signed by society's consent." The fire crackled low. I could not shake the weight of the tale. Even Holmes, I sensed, bore a rare burn of indignation beneath his customary detachment. He turned toward the window, watching as the morning mist crept in from the Thames. "There will be other Sinclairs," he said, almost to himself, "but perhaps fewer Mellingtons, if we do our part." And though the fog outside remained unbroken, I found, in Holmes' final words, a faint glimmer of light trying to reach through it. It was on a quiet Thursday evening that Holmes and I found ourselves walking along the misted banks of the Thames, the gas lamps flickering faintly in the oily fog, and the water whispering dark thoughts beneath the bridges. London, in those hours, seemed less a city than a mind adrift, brooding, ancient, unresolved. We spoke little at first. Holmes, hands folded behind him, paced with long, unhurried strides, his gaze fixed on the serpentine shimmer of the river. I had known him silent, but never quite so distant. "At times," I ventured, "I wonder what lingers longer, the crime or the concealment of it." Holmes did not look at me. "The concealment," he said, "because concealment is a second crime, built not on impulse, but on calculation, and it does not stop once the body is buried." "And yet," I said quietly, "Sinclair lives." Holmes gave the faintest nod. "Yes, but so does the institution that tried to unmake him." The wind off the river picked up, snapping a loose paper along the embankment. I thought of the letter, the rhymes, the doctor, the silence. So many elements adrift, and only one man capable of weaving them into a single thread that pointed, inexorably, to the truth. I could not dismiss the cruelty of it. A man confined to a cell, his voice stolen, his mind dismissed. "It is barbarism," I muttered, "with better drapery." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You speak of the institution?" "Yes," I said more bitterly than I intended. How easily they labelled him, how swiftly the world complied. A man robbed of name, dignity, and narrative. He stopped walking then and looked across the river. The water caught a shard of moonlight, throwing it like a coin across the current. "Do not mistake the walls for the prison, Watson," he said at last. "The true cage is perception. Once the world believes you are mad, you are made so, not by your thoughts, but by their dismissal." "And yet Sinclair endured." Holmes gave a rare smile, dry, almost fond. "Because he knew what they did not. The body may bend, The mind, if it keeps its rhythm, remains unbroken. We resumed our pace, the fog curling about our ankles. Holmes added, almost idly, "He lived through verse what others could not live through reason. There is a strange strength in art, Watson, especially when truth must dress in metaphor to be heard at all." Later, back at Baker Street, as Holmes leaned into his chair and rekindled his pipe, I posed the question that had lingered like a ghost behind every revelation. "Do you think," I asked, "you could have survived it, if they had locked you away?" Holmes regarded me with a look that was neither flattered nor affronted. "With my mind intact?" "Yes." He inhaled, then spoke through the curling blue veil of smoke. "I dare say I should make a very difficult patient. That I don't doubt. But could I survive?" He gave a small smirk. "It would depend on the library and the quality of the cigars." I laughed, despite myself, but beneath the jest, there was something else, something fragile, a flicker of understanding perhaps, that even Holmes was not immune to walls, only more resourceful in dancing between them. I closed my journal that night with a slower hand than usual, the ink on the final line not yet dry as I watched Holmes by the hearth, still staring into the coals. Not all wounds, I have come to believe, are physical. Some leave no mark upon the skin, and yet echo with every step. Sinclair, in escaping the asylum, had not quite escaped the memory of it, and perhaps never would. Holmes caught my gaze and, as though reading my thoughts, said, "Shadows linger longer than bruises." I nodded and added no more. The case was concluded, the villain unmasked, justice, or some approximation of it, delivered. And yet I could not shake the sense that something had been lost. Not a life, perhaps, but a portion of faith. I dipped my pen once more and wrote a final note in the margin. Truth survives, but not always whole. As we walked the last stretch back to Baker Street under the hush of a London dusk, Holmes lit his pipe with a quiet satisfaction. I, still uneasy with the affair's bitter undercurrent, ventured a thought. "Do you believe he ever truly lost his mind, Holmes?" Holmes exhaled a thin curl of smoke and did not look at me. "Madness, my dear Watson, is often merely a mirror turned inward. What the world deems insanity is sometimes only the refusal to lie to oneself." He paused at the edge of the curb, watching a carriage vanish into the fog. It was not the locked doors that nearly undid him. It was the silence. A man may endure chains, but not being forgotten. "Tell me, what do you think was the true turning point in this case? Was it the letter, the lie, or the moment someone finally listened? If this mystery stirred your thoughts, I invite you to share your theories in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more untold cases from the world of Sherlock Holmes, and pass this story along to fellow seekers of truth and shadow. The game, as ever, is afoot.